Jane Austen was born on December 16 of 1775 in the county of Hampshire, in a civil parish known as Steventon, located in a rural village in south of England. She was born a month later than her parents expected. Her father wrote of her arrival in a letter that her mother certainly expected to have been brought to bed a month ago. He added that her arrival was particularly welcome as a future companion to her sister. Her parents were George Austen and Cassandra Lee, which coincidentally gave the same name to her daughter. Due to an insanely cold winter in 1776, Jane was baptized only on 5th of April, 4 months after her birth. George came from an old, respected, and wealthy family of wool merchants. Over the centuries, as each generation of eldest sons received inheritances, their wealth was consolidated, and George's branch of the family fell into poverty. He and his 2 sisters were orphaned as children and had to be taken in by relatives. Cassandra came from the prominent Lee family. Her father was rector at All Souls College, Oxford, where she grew up among the gentry. They married on April 26, 1764 at St. Swithin's Church in Bath, by license, in a simple ceremony. When Jane Austen was born, her mother had already given birth to 5 children: James, George, Edward, Henry Thomas, and Cassandra. Later, 2 younger brothers named Francis and Charles. Cassandra was Jane's closest friend and confidant during her lifetime, and both for some reason didn't marry. Nowadays, the region of Steventon owns a population of 250 people, and some of the places Jane used to frequent still exist. The Church of Steventon, for example, remained untouched ever since that then. At this time, the United Kingdom was then called the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland and was composed of the current Britain territories and Ireland territories combined. The country we know today emerged after the Independence War of Ireland, that later on left the Union, forming its own nation at 1922. The rectory of Steventon where she used to live was demolished after her death, around 1824. But the area is still marked by a lime tree which was probably planted by her brother, James. Besides having 7 rooms, the house was surrounded by fields in which her father worked. All of this contributed greatly to the work of Jane, due to her works being greatly based off her social life in Steventon. It's important to note that the Austen's house had an intellectual atmosphere, and the ideas which they didn't agree on would be considered and discussed. In 1783, Jane and her sister Cassandra were invited to study in Oxford. However, they later returned due to a typhoid fever which nearly killed Jane. Ever since, she took her classes at home, until she started attending boarding school in 1785. They left the boarding school at around December 1786. Private theatricals were an essential part of Austen's education. From her early childhood, the family and friends staged a series of plays in the rectory barn, including Richard Sheridan's The Rivals and David Garrick's Bon Ton. As for Jane's works, not only did they contain deep critiques about life, but also had a fine humor. The scripts were based off stories of love and marriage, showing the daily lives of the characters. She started off at age 11, writing poems and stories for entertainment. At age 12, she attempted to write drama. All of her 29 works written in between 1787 and 1793 were compiled in the book known as Juvenilia. She titled the 3 notebooks, Volume the First, Volume the Second and Volume the Third, which preserve 90,000 words she wrote during those years. The Juvenilia are often, according to scholar Richard Jenkins, boisterous and anarchic. He compares them to the work of 18th-century novelist Laurence Sterne. She also made parodies of historical writings. One of them was the purposely named Love and Friendship, a story dedicated to her cousin Eliza de Filide, and also made to entertain her family. After, she wrote The History of England, a manuscript of 34 pages accompanied by 13 watercolor miniatures by her sister, Cassandra. 1789 was the year when she decided to turn into a professional writer. Her works became longer and more sophisticated. Jane started writing Catherine or the Bower in 1792, but left it incompleted and used parts of the story and used it in her other book Lady Susan, written around 1793 and 1795. A year later, she began but abandoned a short play, later titled Sir Charles Grandison or the Happy Man, a comedy in 6 acts, which she returned to and completed around 1800. This was a short parody of various school textbook abridgments of Austen's favorite contemporary novel, The History of Sir Charles Grandison, by Samuel Richardson. And at age 20, Tom Lefroy visited Jane and resided within Steventon for 2 months, and by judging the letters Jane sent to her sister Cassandra, it was obvious that Lefroy and Austen spent a considerable amount of time together. Describing Lefroy as a handsome gentleman. Years later, Lefroy was still in Jane's mind. She met one of Lefroy's relatives and desperately asked about him. He had just finished a university degree and was moving to London for training as a barrister. She called him her friend and explained that on this account Cassandra must be anxious to know more about her new friend. 5 days later in another letter, Austen wrote she expected an offer from her friend and that I shall refuse him, however, unless he promises to give away his white coat, going on to write I will confine myself in the future to Mr. Tom Lefroy, for whom I don't give a sixpence and refuse all others. The next day, Austen wrote, the day will come on which I flirt my last with Tom Lefroy, and when you receive this it will be all over. My tears flow as I write at this melancholy idea. After finalizing her book Lady Susan, she started her first romance Elinor and Marianne, and after completing this work, she published yet another book called First Impressions, later named as Pride and Prejudice. Pride and Prejudice shows the way that the character Elizabeth Bennet and how she handles with problems related to education, culture, morals and marriage in the aristocratic society of the 1700s in England. Elizabeth is the second of 5 daughters of a landowner on the fictional town of Meryton, in Hertfordshire. On 1 November 1797, Austen's father showed the manuscript to the editor Thomas Cadell, in London, but it was rejected. Austen sold the book's copyrights to Thomas Egerton, which published the first edition in 1813. It was translated in France, then Germany, Denmark, and Sweden, later published for the first time in the USA in August 1832. In December of 1800, her father decided to leave Steventon and moved with her family to Sydney Place, in Bath. It is said that due to moving to Bath, she lost interest in writing, but it was probably due to her not having enough time to do so. Cassandra destroyed all of her letters from 1801 to 1804 for unknown reasons. While retirement and travel were good for the elder Austens, Jane Austen was shocked to be told she was moving from the only home she had ever known. An indication of her state of mind is her lack of productivity as a writer during the time she lived at Bath. She was able to make some revisions to Susan, but there was nothing like the productivity of the years 1795 to 1799. Her next book would be The Watsons, however she wouldn't be able to finish her work as her father would die a year after. In December 1802 Austen received her only known proposal of marriage. She and her sister visited Alethea and Catherine Bigg, old friends who lived near Basingstoke. Their younger brother, Harris Bigwither, had recently finished his education at Oxford and was also at home. Bigwither proposed and Austen accepted. By the next morning, Austen realized she had made a mistake and withdrew her acceptance. At the time, British women did not have the legal power to sign contracts, and it was common for a woman wishing to publish to have a male relative represent her to sign the contract. Like most women authors at the time, Austen's books were published anonymously. At the time, the ideal roles for a woman were as wife and mother, and writing for women was regarded at best as a secondary form of activity. A woman who wished to be a full-time writer was felt to be degrading her femininity, which is why books by women were usually published anonymously in order to maintain the conceit that the female writer was only publishing as a sort of part-time job, and was not seeking to become a literacy lioness. Jane, Cassandra and their mother moved into Chawton Cottage on July 7, 1809. Life was quieter in Chawton than it had been since the family's move to Bath in 1800. The Austens did not socialize with gentry and entertained only when family visited. Her niece Anna described the family's life in Chawton as a very quiet life, according to our ideas, but they were great readers, and besides the housekeeping our aunts occupied themselves in working with the poor and in teaching some girl or boy to read or write. During her time at Chawton, Jane Austen published 4 generally well-received novels. With the death of George Austen, her family moved to Southampton, where she started to get sick. Ignoring the warnings to go to a doctor, at around 1816, she kept working. It is unknown what disease she contracted, but many evidences point to arsenic poisoning, which can cause raindrop pigmentation, where patches of skin go brown or black, and other areas go white. By the middle of that year, her decline was unmistakable, and she began a slow, irregular deterioration. When her uncle died and left his entire fortune to his wife, effectively disinheriting his relatives, she suffered a relapse, writing, "I am ashamed to say that the shock of my uncles will brought on a relapse, but the weak body must excuse weak nerves." Dissatisfied with the ending of the Iliads, she rewrote the final 2 chapters, which she finished on August 6, 1816. In January 1817 Austen began The Brothers, titled Sanditon when published in 1925, and completed 12 chapters before stopping work in mid-March 1817, probably due to illness. She put down her pen on March 18, 1817, making a note of it. She experienced difficulty walking and lacked energy. By mid-April she was confined to bed. As her disease progressed, she was sent to Winchester for treatment, where she finally succumbed to her illness in July 8, 1817, at a young age of 41 years. After Austen's death, Cassandra, Henry Austen and Murray arranged for the publication of Persuasion and Northanger Abbey as a set. Henry Austen contributed a biographical note which for the first time identified his sister as the author of the novels. However, her legacy wasn't over. Austen had many admiring readers in the 19th century who considered themselves part of a literary elite. Her works survived the tests of time, receiving movie adaptations. The first adaptation being from her book Pride and Prejudice in 1940, and the most recent in 2016, a version of Lady Susan, which borrowed the name Love and Friendship. Currently, her books are known all over the world.